The posting had been live on the Galactic Coalition's internal job board for 47 standard days before anyone applied. Senior Logistics Coordinator Vethanaras of the Pelinoth species, 7-limbed, gray-scaled, and possessed of 4 independently operating eyes that allowed her to read 4 documents simultaneously, had refreshed the board every morning out of habit. And every morning for 47 days, she had seen the same listing sitting there like an untouched meal, slowly going cold. Station posting, Way Station Calvary 9. 1-1 Human Resource Liaison. Duties include welcoming incoming human visitors, coordinating their integration with station protocol, managing any incidents arising from human behavioral unpredictability. Duration, 18 standard months. Location, Deep Transit Corridor 7, Sector 44 Null. Nearest populated system, 14.3 light days. The problem wasn't the human part. Humans had been coalition members for 60 years now, and while they remained, diplomatically speaking, a handful asterisk, nobody openly discriminated anymore. The problem was the location. Sector 44 Null was, as its designation politely implied, largely nothing. Way Station Calvary 9 existed to service deep corridor freight transit and not much else. It had a crew of 31. A commissary that was rumored to serve edible food on alternate days, and a subspace relay that lagged 12 minutes behind the main coalition network. It was, in the language of every species that had a word for it, boring. Humans, by all accounts, handled boring very poorly. Vethanaras had been about to archive the listing, assuming no human would ever apply either, when a new application appeared in her queue on day 48. She opened it with the tentacle she reserved for low-priority tasks. The applicant's name was James Kowalski. His file photo showed a broad-shouldered human male, dark-haired, 31 standard years old by human reckoning. His record was clean in the way that made experienced administrators nervous. No formal infractions, but a series of notations from previous postings that collectively painted a picture. Kowalski demonstrates exceptional initiative. Commander Yathsarel, Way Station Dorvis 3. Kowalski's contributions to station maintenance efficiency exceeded all projected benchmarks. His project scope, however, expanded well beyond the original brief. Administrator Pellos, Trading Hub Cressida ***. Mr. Kowalski is creative, energetic, and resourceful. We wish him well at his next posting. Chief of Operations Unmar, Coalition Freight Hub Theta 9. That last one had been filed 3 weeks after Kowalski had apparently reorganized the entire freight hub's cargo categorization system from scratch, single-handedly, over the course of one very long weekend, because he'd been placed on administrative leave pending a minor investigation, and had, in his own words, gotten a little antsy. Vethanaras stared at the file for a long time with all 4 of her eyes. Then she approved the application, because the listing had been sitting there for 47 days and her supervisor had started sending her pointed messages about it, and because Way Station Calvary 9 was very far away and very isolated, and whatever James Kowalski did there, it would at least be someone else's problem. She logged his start date, sent him the orientation packet, and went back to her other 3 documents. She would think about this decision again, later, quite often. James Kowalski arrived at Way Station Calvary 9 on a standard Tuesday. Not that Tuesday meant anything out in Sector 44 Null, where the station ran on a 26-hour artificial day cycle pegged to no planet in particular, aboard a freight hauler called the Enduring Patience ***, which he privately thought was a good omen. He liked patience. He would admit, not always had much of it, but he'd been working on it. The station was smaller than he'd expected. That was saying something, because he had set his expectations very low. He'd read the posting 3 times, done his research, understood what he was getting into. He'd even been honest with himself about his reasons for applying. He needed somewhere quiet to get his head straight. The past 2 years had been chaotic. Not through any major catastrophe, no wars, no tragedies, nothing dramatic. Just the accumulated noise of too many postings in too many busy places, too much stimulation, too many people wanting things from him all the time. He was good at his job. He was good at a lot of jobs, which turned out to be both a blessing and a problem, because people kept finding new jobs for him to be good at, and he kept saying yes because he didn't really know how to say no, and somewhere in the middle of all that he'd lost the thread of what he actually wanted. Calvary 9 was his attempt at a reset. 18 months, Sector 44 null, population 31, now 32 including himself. He could do that. The station's docking arm extended to meet the hauler with a mechanical groan that suggested maintenance backlogs. James noted that, not as a problem to fix, just as information. He was just going to observe for a while, get settled, do his actual job competently, and be still. He stepped through the airlock with a single duffel bag over one shoulder and a small case in his other hand that contained his hobby supplies. Watercolors, mostly. He'd always meant to get into painting. This seemed like a good time. Station Commander Uravel met him at the dock. She was Vaskari, tall, thin-limbed, with bioluminescent patches on her neck that flickered in patterns James had learned corresponded to emotional states. Hers were currently cycling through what the Vaskari cultural guide in his orientation packet had described as cautious professional welcome. "Liaison Kowalski," she said, "welcome to Calvary 9. "Thank you, Commander, glad to be here." He meant it. The station was quiet. He could already feel the quietness of it, like stepping out of a noisy room into an empty hallway. Nice place. Commander Uravel's bioluminescent patches flickered in a pattern that wasn't in the orientation packet. He'd learn later it meant something like he can't possibly mean that, but in a fond, bemused way. "Your quarters are on level 3, she said. "Crew orientation is at 0800 tomorrow. Tonight you're off duty. The commissary closes at 2200. "Understood." He looked around the docking bay. Clean enough, but the conduit housings along the upper wall were showing stress fractures in the sealant. Standard maintenance drift. He wasn't going to say anything. "Is there anything I need to do tonight?" "Number rest, settle in." "Perfect," said James Kowalski. He went to his quarters, unpacked his duffel, set up his watercolor supplies on the small desk by the porthole, and looked out at the deep black of Sector 44 null, which was very dark and very empty and very, very quiet. He lasted 11 days. Part 2, the first project. It started, as these things always did, innocently enough. James had attended the crew orientation. He'd met his colleagues, 2 Pelinoth freight coordinators, a Vaskari engineering team of 4, a pair of ancient and deeply unbothered Grethali traders who seemed to regard the station as an extended vacation, a Thalonian medical officer named Dr. Karish, who communicated primarily in disapproving silences, and various others who orbited the station's operations in their specific ways. He'd started his actual job, which involved processing human visitor paperwork for the occasional freight hauler crew and sending polite update reports to the Coalition's Cultural Integration Office. The paperwork took him approximately 40 minutes per day, sometimes less. He painted, he read. He walked the station's 3 habitable levels, clocking approximately 4 kilometers per day in circuits of the corridors. He watched the freight haulers come and go, which happened every 2 or 3 days. He was polite and pleasant and helpful and did not reorganize anything. On day 11, he was walking past the station's secondary engineering bay, the smaller one, currently designated as a storage overflow, when he heard an unusual sound. A rhythmic, high-pitched whine, irregular, like something struggling. He stopped, listened. It was coming from behind a stack of decommissioned cargo manifests that hadn't been updated since before he was born. He traced it to a secondary atmospheric scrubber unit mounted in the back corner of the bay. The unit was running hot, you could tell by the discoloration on the housing, and the filtration cycle was cycling at the wrong interval. He stood there for a long moment. Then he found the station's engineering chief, a Vaskari named Toranav, who was technically responsible for all mechanical systems, and reported it. Toranav listened, nodded his elongated head, and said the unit was on the maintenance backlog. It had been on the maintenance backlog for about 8 months. It wasn't critical. There were 2 other scrubbers on the same level. He'd get to it eventually. James went back to his quarters and painted a very careful watercolor of the view from his porthole. Sector 44 null looked, he decided, like deep blue nothing which was restful. He was being restful. He looked at the painting for a while. He went back to the engineering bay with a borrowed toolkit and fixed the scrubber. It took him about 3 hours. The filtration matrix was partially clogged and one of the cycle regulators had drifted out of calibration, standard wear, nothing exotic. He cleaned it out, recalibrated the regulator, ran the diagnostic cycle, listened to the unit settle into its correct rhythm. The irregular whine disappeared. He put the toolkit back exactly where he'd found it and went to dinner. The next morning, Toranav found him in the commissary and asked, in the careful tone of someone who wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or grateful, if James had fixed the scrubber. Just the filtration cycle and the regulator, James said. Nothing structural. I hope that's okay. Toranav's bioluminescent patches flickered in a rapid sequence. You have engineering experience. Some, I've picked things up at various postings. The scrubber was on the maintenance backlog, Toranav said, which was not quite a reprimand. I know I should have checked with you first, sorry about that. James meant it. It was making a sound that bothered me. I'll ask next time. Toranav looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, with the careful precision of someone offering a peace treaty, there are 14 other items on the maintenance backlog. There was a pause. I'm not doing anything this afternoon, said James. Toranav pulled up his list. The 14 items became 22 once James started actually getting into things, because maintenance backlogs had a way of revealing their true scope only under scrutiny. He worked through them methodically over the next 3 weeks, in his off-duty hours, checking with Toranav before touching anything, learning the station's systems with the particular focused intensity he brought to any problem he decided to be interested in. Commander Urivel called him into her office on week 4. You've resolved all of Toranav's outstanding maintenance backlog, she said. Yes, Commander. And updated the maintenance schedule to a predictive model rather than a reactive one. I found a paper on predictive maintenance systems for deep space installations. It seemed applicable. She looked at him with the particular four-eyed steadiness that the Vaskari used when they were thinking carefully. You were posted here as a cultural liaison. I know, the liaison work is current. I'm not behind on anything. He paused. I finished the maintenance in my personal time. You don't have to do that. I know. He thought about how to explain this in a way that made sense. Commander, I need something to do with my hands, or my head, something to solve. I'm not trying to overstep. But if I sit in my quarters for another afternoon staring at a painting I finished 3 days ago, I'm going to start reorganizing things that didn't need reorganizing, and that'll probably be more disruptive. Commander Urivel's bioluminescent patches did the complex cycling thing that he was slowly learning. Meant she was doing several kinds of thinking at once. What else would you like to do? She asked, in a tone that suggested she was already somewhat resigned to the answer. James had a list. He'd been keeping it in a small notebook, a physical paper notebook, which several of his alien colleagues had found charmingly archaic since his first week on the station. He pulled it out. "May I?" he said. She gestured assent. He talked for 45 minutes. She asked questions. He answered them. By the end of the meeting, she had authorized 6 projects from his list and told him the other 4 needed to go through the coalition's formal approval process, which she would help him initiate. "One more question," she said, as he was getting up to leave. "Sure." "The orientation packet for new human staff." She pulled up a document on her display. It says, and I quote, "Human personnel may experience restlessness or behavioral changes when stationed in low-stimulus environments for extended periods. Supervisors are advised to monitor for signs of this and consider additional task assignments. Were you aware of this notation when you applied?" James smiled. It was a slightly rueful smile. "I've read it before, yeah." "And you applied anyway?" "I needed quiet," he said. "That part's still true, but quiet doesn't mean empty. He paused, trying to find the right words. "I needed to choose what to do with the quiet, rather than have someone else fill it for me." Commander Uravel watched him for a moment, and her bioluminescent patches did something slow and warm that he'd never seen before. He'd learn later that it meant something like, "I think I understand you." Part 3, The Problem with Problems. By month 4, James Kowalski had become, through no deliberate intention, the most useful person on Way Station Kelvari 9. This was not something he'd set out to accomplish. He would have insisted, if pressed, that he was just staying busy. But there was a meaningful difference between staying busy and the particular way James stayed busy, which involved an absolute inability to walk past a problem without at least thinking about it, and an equally absolute inability to keep thinking about it without eventually doing something. He'd fixed the maintenance backlog. He developed a new cargo routing optimization for the freight terminal that cut turnaround time by about 22%. He'd noticed an inefficiency in the scheduling logic while helping a confused human freighter crew with their docking paperwork, followed the thread, and 3 days later had presented Freight Coordinator Pellinor with a complete revised protocol. He'd learned enough Vaskari medical terminology to serve as a translator for Dr. Karish when the doctor was treating human patients, because it turned out Dr. Karish was a genuinely excellent physician who simply couldn't be bothered to learn enough about human physiology, and had been operating with a dangerous gap in her reference materials, which James had quietly filled in by writing a 40-page supplementary guide using his coalition medical database access, and a lot of evenings. The Gret Holly traders Vaughn and Sella, who had been drifting through this corner of the galaxy for approximately 300 years and had seen everything, had taken to spending their evenings in the commissary with James, which surprised everyone who knew them, because Vaughn and Sella had not voluntarily spent time with non-Gret Holly in living memory. They found him, Vaughn explained when someone asked, *novel***. Most species in the galaxy, when faced with an empty afternoon, found a comfortable position and waited. Humans, when faced with an empty afternoon, invented something. This was, Vaughn said, either the most wonderful or the most alarming thing about them, and after 4 months of observing James Kowalski, she had decided it was both simultaneously. The thing that made James particularly interesting, or particularly concerning, depending on your perspective, was that he was not reckless. He did not improvise wildly. He was methodical, careful, thorough. He checked his work. He asked before he touched things that weren't his to touch. He documented everything, which was something most engineers didn't bother with and which made Toranav quietly delighted, because it meant the maintenance logs were finally comprehensible. He was also, and this was the part that took people by surprise, extremely patient when the thing he was working on required patience. It was only the waiting that he couldn't stand, not the work itself. "I've been thinking," said James, one evening in month 5, settling into his chair across from Vaughn and Sella in the commissary. Vaughn, who was approximately the shape and color of a large amber-toned starfish, and communicated through a translator implant of antique design, said, "We know. Is it that obvious?" "You have a particular expression," said Sella, who was Vaughn's partner and roughly the same shape but a deeper orange. "That appears when you have been thinking about something for a while. Your face becomes very still. It is the opposite of your usual expression, which moves a great deal." "Right," James set down his food tray. "So I was looking at the subspace relay." Vaughn and Sella exchanged a look, which was a challenging thing for beings without clear faces, but they managed it. "The communication relay," Vaughn said. "The one that runs 12 minutes behind the main coalition network, yeah. That is the standard lag for this distance from the relay hub." "It is," James agreed. "But the reason it's running 12 minutes behind is that the signal amplification array is working at about 68% efficiency. The housing took micrometeor damage about a year ago, small stuff, nothing dangerous, but it degraded the focusing elements. If you ran it at full efficiency, the lag would drop to about 8 minutes. A pause. 8 minutes is still a long time, Sella said carefully. It is, James said. But here's the thing. I was looking at the relay architecture, and there's actually a way to stack the signal using the freight hauler transponders as passive relay nodes when they're in range. It's technically within coalition communication standards, I checked. If you time the signal boosts right, you could theoretically get the effective lag down to about 4 minutes during peak transit windows. Vaughn and Sella were both very still. You have been here 5 months, Vaughn said. Yeah. And in 5 months you have repaired the mechanical systems, redesigned the cargo logistics, written a medical reference guide, and now you have found a way to improve subspace communication for this entire sector of the transit corridor. Well, I haven't done it yet. I'd need Commander Uravel's approval, and the relay work would need a licensed communications technician to sign off on the array adjustments. I just worked out the theory. Kowalski, said Sella, in the tone of someone who had been traveling the galaxy for 3 centuries and had developed a reasonably accurate sense of when they were witnessing something significant. What were you like before you came here? James thought about it. Busier, he said finally, louder. I had more to do, but I was doing most of it wrong. And now? He looked around the commissary, the familiar worn surfaces, the hum of the station systems running clean and smooth around them, the dark porthole windows showing the deep black of Sector 44 null, which he'd come to find genuinely beautiful. Now I'm doing less, but I know why I'm doing it. Vaughn made a sound that her translator rendered as contemplative humming. We have met many humans, she said. Over many years. They are remarkable in many ways, but most of them, she paused, choosing words, most of them do not know why they are doing what they are doing. They simply do it because they cannot stop. Yeah, James said quietly, I know. You are different. I'm working on being different. He picked up his fork. Ask me again in 6 months. Part 4, the day everything went wrong. Month 7 arrived, and with it, without warning, an actual crisis. It began on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, or at least, a day the station's calendar designated Tuesday, when a collective freighter called the * Marginal Returns attempted to dock at Arm 3, and its docking computer locked up mid-approach. This was unusual but not catastrophic. The station's traffic control system, operated by a Pelinoth coordinator named Vassar, was designed to handle exactly this kind of emergency. Vassar would take manual control, guide the freighter in safely, and everyone would file the appropriate reports. Except that as Vassar was initiating the manual override, the traffic control console gave a quiet, dignified chirp and went dark. This had never happened before. The traffic control console going dark while a freighter was in mid-approach in a transit corridor was, by a significant margin, the most dangerous thing that could happen on Waystation Kelvari 9. The asterisk marginal returns was now decelerating under autopilot toward a docking arm without guidance, in a corridor with two other freighters in transit, with 12 minutes of subspace lag making any request for outside help effectively useless for the duration of the emergency. Commander Uravel hit the emergency alarm and ran for the control deck. James Kowalski heard the alarm from the secondary engineering bay, where he'd been doing the authorized survey of the subspace relay housing. He moved without thinking, not toward the control deck, because that was Uravel's domain and she didn't need him there, but toward the emergency systems junction on level 2, because 3 months ago he'd read the station's full technical schematics as part of the maintenance project, and he knew exactly where the traffic control backup power feeds were. The console had gone dark. Consoles didn't just go dark. There was either a power failure or a software crash, and if it was a software crash, the backup system should have kept the hardware running. So it was a power failure, or rather, a power interruption asterisk, because the main power was clearly still on. Localized interruption, which meant a conduit fault somewhere between the main power grid and the traffic control system. He was already at the junction panel, already running the diagnostic. There, a conduit relay on level 2, section 7, one of the areas he hadn't gotten to yet in the maintenance work, which he noted with a private wince, had shorted. The short was contained. It hadn't propagated. The traffic control system was isolated, running on nothing. He could bypass the faulted relay and restore power from the secondary conduit in the cross corridor. He pulled up the schematic on his handheld, traced the path, confirmed it was clear. Standard bypass procedure. He'd done it 3 times during the maintenance project. He opened the panel, reached in and started working. Kowalski. Commander Uravel's voice came over the communicator clipped to his collar. Her bioluminescent patches, he knew without seeing her, would be cycling very fast right now. The traffic control console is conduit relay fault, level 2, section 7, he said, not stopping. I'm bypassing from the secondary. Give me 90 seconds. A pause. The asterisk marginal returns has approximately 4 minutes before it reaches the docking threshold. 90 seconds, he repeated. He worked. The bypass junction was awkward. It was in the back of the panel, which required him to angle his arm in a way that his shoulder did not love. But the connections were standard, and his hands knew what they were doing without him having to think about them. He'd always found that useful, the way hands could operate independently of the part of the brain that panicked. His hands didn't panic, they just worked. 63 seconds after he'd opened the panel, he heard the traffic control console power up. He knew because Vassar made a sound over the communicator that his translator rendered as asterisk enormous relief. He heard Commander Uravel give rapid instructions. He heard the docking guidance system activate. He stayed where he was, keeping the bypass stable until he heard, "Marginal returns is on approach. All clear." Then he let out a breath and sat down on the corridor floor with his back against the wall, because his legs had decided this was a reasonable time to shake a little, and he wasn't going to fight them on it. Toranav found him there 3 minutes later. The engineering chief looked at the open panel, at James, at the panel again. His bioluminescent patches were doing something complicated. "You knew where the fault was," he said. "I read the schematics, all of them." James thought about getting up, decided to wait another minute. Level 2, section 7 has older conduit runs. I flagged it for the next phase of the maintenance schedule. I should have prioritized it higher. The fault was a manufacturing variance in the relay casing, Toranav said. It was not detectable without, he paused, without having read the entire technical schematics and retained their layout. "I have a pretty good memory for systems," James said. It wasn't quite modesty, it was just accurate. Toranav crouched down so that his eye level was closer to James's. For a Vaskari, this was a gesture of deliberate informality. How long did it take you to read the station's complete technical documentation? About 4 evenings. Because you were bored. James considered this. Because I was curious, he said finally. The boredom just cleared out enough space for the curiosity to work. Toranav looked at him for a long moment. His bioluminescent patches settled into the slow, warm pattern that James now recognized from Commander Uravel, the one that meant something like "I think I understand you." "Come," said Toranav. "The commander will want to speak with you." Yeah, James got up. His legs had sorted themselves out, probably. Part 5, The Reputation. News traveled slowly in Sector 44 null, but it traveled. The incident with the marginal returns was logged in the Coalition's Incident Report database, as all such near misses were required to be. It was a short, factual report that described the conduit fault, the near accident, and the resolution. It named James Kowalski as the crew member who had identified and bypassed the fault, and gave his posting title as Human Resource Liaison. The freight pilots who'd been in the corridor that day, the crew of the Asterisk Marginal Returns Asterisk, plus 2 other haulers who'd been watching their own navigation systems with their hearts in their throats, told the story to other crews at other waystation commissaries throughout the next few weeks, because stories were the primary currency of deep transit freight culture. The story, as stories do, grew somewhat in the telling. By the time it reached Freight Hub Theta 9, where James had previously worked, it involved him single-handedly rebuilding the traffic control system from raw components in under a minute. By the time it made it to Coalition Transit Authority headquarters, the retelling had him identifying the fault type by sound. By the time it filtered through the informal network of waystation personnel across 5 sectors, there were versions where he'd predicted the fault before it happened. None of these were quite true, but they were all in the right direction. The subtler story, the one that was harder to tell in commissary shorthand, but that the people who'd actually been at Calvary 9 understood, was about the 7 months before the incident. About what James Kowalski had done with 18 months in the quietest corner of the Sector 44 transit corridor, when someone had handed him the time and the space to actually think. The Coalition Transit Authority sent Commander Uravel a formal inquiry 3 months after the incident, asking for a comprehensive report on Waystation Calvary 9 maintenance and operational improvements since the posting of 1J Kowalski, Human Liaison. The inquiry came from a senior director of operations who had been looking at the station's efficiency metrics and found them difficult to explain. Uravel wrote the report personally. She was thorough. She documented the maintenance backlog resolution, the cargo routing protocol, the medical supplement, the subspace relay improvement proposal, now approved and in preliminary implementation, the updated predictive maintenance schedule, and a dozen smaller things that hadn't made it into official records, but that had quietly improved life on the station in ways both tangible and not. She included one paragraph at the end that she had thought about carefully before writing. It would be easy to attribute the improvements to Mr. Kowalski's technical competence, which is considerable. It would be equally easy to attribute them to human behavioral characteristics, the species' well-documented restlessness and need for stimulation in low-stimulus environments. Both observations would be accurate but incomplete. What distinguished Mr. Kowalski's contributions was not what he did, but how he decided what to do. He spent his first weeks here choosing to be still. Most humans cannot do this, and many who try find it produces anxiety rather than clarity. Kowalski appears to have learned, through some process I was not present for, how to be still without being empty. What he did with that stillness is recorded above. I offer this observation not as a formal assessment, but because I believe the Transit Authority's inquiry was genuinely trying to understand the cause, not merely catalog the effects. The Senior Director of Operations read this paragraph 4 times. Then she forwarded the report to a colleague at the Coalition's Human Integration Research Institute with a note that said simply, Thought this might interest you. Part 6, Month 12. By month 12, Way Station Calvary 9 had something it had never had in its 14-year operational history: a waiting list. Not a long one, not a famous one. But word had gotten through the freight transit network that Calvary 9 was, and this was the specific phrasing that kept appearing in multiple languages, because it was the most accurate way to say it: running right asterisk. The cargo turnaround was faster. The maintenance was current. The medical bay had better reference materials than most stations twice its size. The subspace relay, with the new signal stacking protocol, was down to 6 minutes of lag during transit windows, which for Sector 44 null was essentially miraculous. Freight captains who had a choice of resupply stops were choosing Calvary 9. The station's throughput had increased by 31% over the year. Crew assignments that had previously gone unfilled for months were now competitive. Commander Uravel found this both gratifying and slightly alarming, because she knew it had a human-shaped cause who had 6 months left on his posting. She had the conversation she'd been preparing for on a quiet afternoon in month 12, in her office, over the Vascari equivalent of tea, which was a faintly luminescent beverage that James had been told was an acquired taste, and had acquired, somewhat to everyone's surprise, in about 3 weeks. "You have 6 months left," she said. "Yeah," he turned his cup in his hands. "I've been thinking about that." "Have you?" The relay project will be fully operational by month 15, with the hardware adjustments. The predictive maintenance schedule runs itself now. Toranav knows the system better than I do at this point. The cargo protocols embedded in the station's standard operating procedures. He paused. "You don't need me for any of that anymore." "We don't," Uravel agreed. "So the question is whether the coalition needs me here for something else, or whether I should." He stopped. "Or whether you should what?" He looked out the porthole at Sector 44 null, the deep black nothing that he'd come to find honestly and genuinely beautiful. "I don't know," he said. "That's new for me, not knowing what comes next." "Is it uncomfortable?" "A little," he thought about it, "less than it would have been a year ago." Commander Uravel set down her cup. "I have been authorized to offer you a position," she said. "A different one. The Coalition's Transit Infrastructure Division is creating a new role. They're calling it a Deep Corridor Improvement Specialist. The brief is to do what you've been doing here, but at stations throughout the Deep Corridor network. 6-month rotations, one after another." James was quiet for a moment. "Who created that role?" "The Director of Operations at Transit Authority Headquarters, with input from the Human Integration Research Institute." Uravel's bioluminescent patches flickered with something wry. "Apparently you have become, in some quarters, a case study." "Because I got bored and fixed a maintenance backlog." "Because," Uravel said precisely, "you arrived at a dying station in an empty sector, and in 12 months you turned it into somewhere people want to be. And you did it without a mandate, without a title that covered any of it, and without, and this is the part that interests the researchers, ever appearing to rush." James looked at his cup. "The rush was the problem before." "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, the comfortable quiet of someone who was thinking, not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who didn't know what to say. "I spent a long time being very busy," he said, "doing a lot of things fast, and I was good at it, which made it worse, because being good at it meant more things got added, and I kept saying yes, and eventually I was doing 20 things at speed and none of them especially well, and I wasn't." He paused. "I wasn't actually choosing any of them. They were just there, and I was filling them. And here I had to choose." He looked up at her. "There was nothing here, nothing but what I brought with me and what I noticed when I looked around. And some of what I noticed was," he smiled slightly, "a scrubber unit making a bad noise, which was not a galaxy-changing observation, but it was mine." Uravel was quiet for a long moment. Her bioluminescent patches moved in a slow, complex pattern that James had learned over 12 months to recognize as deep thought. "You said once," she said, "that you needed to choose what to do with the quiet." "Yeah. Have you?" He thought about the maintenance logs, clean and current, the cargo protocol running smooth, the relay project humming along. Dr. Karish, who had started actually talking to him after he'd finished the medical guide, and had turned out to be deeply funny in an extremely dry way. Vaughn and Sella, who had extended their stay by 4 months and showed no current intention of leaving. Toranav, who had taught him 3 Vaskari engineering techniques in exchange for 2 human ones, and now considered this a fair trade that he would defend vigorously. The watercolor paintings on his wall, he'd done 19 of them, mostly views from his porthole, each one a little better than the last. "Yeah," he said. "I think I have." Part 7, the thing nobody put in the report. There was something Commander Uravel had not included in her report to the Coalition Transit Authority, not because it was unimportant, but because it was the kind of thing that was difficult to quantify, and she had already taken enough space with her philosophical paragraph. In month 9, there had been a new arrival at Kalvari 9, a young Vaskari engineering apprentice named Sariko, fresh from training on her first real posting. She was technically proficient, well-educated, and absolutely convinced that she was going to fail at everything. This conviction was very quiet and very internal, and it expressed itself only in the particular way Sariko held herself when she thought no one was watching. Slightly too careful, slightly too hesitant, spending twice as long as necessary on every task because she was terrified of doing it wrong. James noticed within the first week, because James noticed things. He didn't say anything about what he'd noticed. He just started spending time in the engineering bay during Sariko's shifts, ostensibly working on his own projects, occasionally asking her questions about the systems in a way that was clearly genuine curiosity and not testing, and listening carefully to her answers. He made mistakes in front of her, small ones on purpose, and then corrected them matter-of-factly, the way someone who was comfortable with making mistakes corrected them. Without drama, without self-flagellation, just here's the error, here's the fix, moving on. He didn't say, "It's okay to make mistakes." He knew that telling someone that rarely helped. He just demonstrated it repeatedly, in the particular way that humans had of teaching things by doing them in front of you until the lesson stopped feeling like a lesson and started feeling like a fact. By month 11, Sariko was working at full speed and had started pointing out things she noticed without waiting to see if someone else had spotted them first. Toranav mentioned this to James, once obliquely. "She's good," James said. "She just needed to settle in." Toranav looked at him with the four-eyed Vaskari gaze that always made James feel like he was being read from several angles at once. "She settled in considerably faster than the apprentices I have had at previous stations. New places are disorienting." "Yes," said Toranav, "they are." A pause. "You were never disoriented here." "Sure I was. I had something to do with it." It was the kind of statement that sounded simple and was not, which was, Toranav had come to understand, a characteristic of how James Kowalski talked about himself. He used ordinary words for things that were not ordinary. Part 8, the last 6 months and after. James Kowalski spent his last 6 months at Waystation Kalvari 9 doing what he'd spent the first 12 doing. Noticing things, fixing things, talking to people, and occasionally sitting very still in the commissary in the evenings with Vaughn and Sella, watching the dark of Sector 44 null through the porthole while the station hummed around him. He accepted the deep corridor improvement specialist position. Of course he did. He was interested in it, which was the primary criterion he'd started applying to decisions. He finished the relay project. He wrote up a detailed handover document for every system he'd touched, which Toranav took to calling asterisk the Kowalski Bible with the tone of someone who was being exaggeratedly derisive, but secretly deeply grateful. He taught Sariko the bypass procedure for the traffic control conduit, and made her run it 3 times until she could do it in 60 seconds. He wrote a small supplementary guide for whoever would be handling the human visitor liaison work after him, which included a section titled What Human Crew Members Actually Need That They Probably Won't Ask for asterisk, which Dr. Karish read when he wasn't looking, and then claimed she hadn't. On his last evening, the entire crew gathered in the commissary, all 31 of them, plus 4 freight captains who timed their transits to be in dock that day, plus Vaughn and Sella, who had lingered long past any practical reason, and had by this point simply made Kelvari 9 their base of operations, which they showed no signs of reconsidering. There were speeches. James was not good at receiving speeches, which everyone knew, and so the speeches were kept short and then someone put on music, a compromise between the 3 musical traditions represented on the station, which produced something that shouldn't have worked and somehow did, and there was food, and that was better. Vaughn found him later, standing at the porthole in the commissary corridor, looking out at Sector 44 null. "You will miss it," she said. It was not a question. Yeah, he would. He already did preemptively, which was a strange kind of grief. I didn't expect that. What did you expect? He thought about it. I thought I'd get through it, survive the quiet, go somewhere else after. And instead he paused, watching the dark. I found something I wanted, not what I was supposed to want or what I was good at or what someone needed from me. Just, he made a gesture with his hand that was not quite pointing at the station around them and not quite pointing at himself. This. Vaughn was quiet for a moment. That is a thing most beings spend their whole lives not managing, she said. I know, he turned from the porthole. I got lucky. You were bored, Vaughn said, in the specific dry tone she developed over 300 years and applied to things that were much larger than they sounded. James laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere solid. Yeah, he said, I was bored. Epilogue, what the galaxy learned. The official record is straightforward enough. James Kowalski served 18 months at Waystation Kelvari 9 as Human Resource Liaison, during which time he improved the station's operational efficiency, resolved significant maintenance backlogs, developed new logistics and communications protocols, and provided emergency assistance that prevented a potentially serious docking accident. He subsequently accepted a position as Deep Corridor Improvement Specialist, serving rotating postings at 11 Waystation facilities over the following 4 years, and producing similar results at each. The unofficial record is harder to write down but better remembered. The Vaskari have a concept in their cultural framework, a word that translates imperfectly as *Kethavar, meaning roughly the state of productive stillness, or the creative potential of an empty space held with intention rather than filled with noise. It's considered a wisdom state, something the elders teach but that most beings have to discover for themselves. It takes most Vaskari a lifetime. Some never find it. Toranav, explaining this to a young engineering colleague some years after Kelvari 9, paused and then said, There was a human here once. He found it in about 3 months. How? The colleague asked. He was bored, Toranav said. The colleague looked puzzled, as well they might. The human species, Toranav continued, settling into the posture he adopted when he was going to say something he'd thought about carefully, carries within it a capacity that the rest of the galaxy tends to misread. We see their restlessness and we call it a liability. We see their inability to sit still and we file reports about managing it. We see what they do when given an empty afternoon and we describe it in terms of what problems it might cause. He paused. And sometimes it does cause problems. This is true. But boredom for a human is not simply discomfort. It is pressure. It is a compressed spring, and the question of what a compressed spring does when it is finally aimed at something, he paused again, is not the question we should be afraid to answer. The young colleague thought about this. What did the human do, they asked, after Kelvari 9? Toranav's bioluminescent patches moved in a slow, pleased pattern. 11 more stations, he said, in 4 years, and at every one of them he arrived, looked around, noticed things, and fixed them, not because he was told to, not because it was his job description, because he had found, in a very quiet corner of Sector 44 Null, the particular and apparently quite human trick of knowing what you want to do with your time. He stood up. The coalition now has a program, he added. They call it the Human Quiet Initiative. They send humans to deep corridor postings, not to manage them or contain them or keep them busy so they don't cause trouble, to give them room. He shrugged, a human gesture he'd picked up over the years and never quite lost. The results have been, I believe the word is, astonishing. And somewhere in Sector 44 Null, on a small way station that ran better than stations 3 times its size, in a corridor that had once held a maintenance backlog nobody got to and a scrubber unit making a sound that nobody heard, the lights were clean and bright, and the systems hummed and the predictive maintenance schedule checked itself automatically, because a bored human had once had an empty afternoon and decided, for no better reason than that the noise bothered him, to listen for it. The most dangerous weapon in the galaxy. A human's boredom. Properly aimed. And word count, ~9, 800 words estimated duration, minutes at 160 WPM.